Assalamu alaikum and good evening to everyone out there in the world. I want to welcome you to Sapelo Live. Sapelo Live is a series of conversations that the website, the platform Sapelo Square will be hosting over the next few months to give you more of what you love about Sapelo Square, but in a new way. We're turning 5 actually this year. Our anniversary date is the birthday of Malcolm X, May 19th. And we had big plans, right? We wanted to bring you much more Sapelo Square, but bring it to you offline. And then the Rona hit, right? And revealed a lot about our communities and about our societies, about what we are strong in and where we are weak. And we ask Allah, the most merciful, the most gracious, and the healer to bring a swift end to this plague. Tonight, I am Dr. Abdul Khabeer. I'm the senior editor at Sapelo Square. And tonight, we are joined by our esteemed guest, Rasul Miller. Rasul Miller is a historian of Black Muslim communities in the Atlantic world. And Atlantic world is a term folks use to describe sort of this side of the Atlantic, or the Atlantic, sort of the kind of the sort of from Africa to the New World, right? So in terms of the Atlantic. He received his PhD in history and Africana studies from the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include Muslim movements in the 20th century America and their relationship to Black internationalism and West African intellectual history. He currently serves as a postdoctoral associate in the study of the racialization of Islam at Yale University Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. Do you have an announcement to make about where you're going next, Russell? No?
No.
Okay, not yet. Great.
Not yet.
And then, but soon. I think he has some good news soon, so I'm excited to share that when it's ready. Yeah. But I think the most important thing not the most important, but for me, one of the most important things about Russell's bio is that he's an OG Sapelo Squad member, right? When we first launched way back in 2015, he was on the squad originally as our history editor, and he did some really good work with us. So thank you for your contributions, and thank you for your latest contribution, right? The Black American Sufi, a history. So I have a couple questions. So what we'll do is I'll have a couple questions for you about sort of your research, about the work, about the article, and then I know we got folks who are super excited that this is going to happen, and so we're hoping there'll be some questions as well from the audience, and we'll take those as well. Cool. So to start us off, could you maybe just give us a little bit tell us about who you are and your research?
Right. Well, assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super geeked. Sapelo is family. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. I can't talk about this and not start with Salatul Fatih. It just wouldn't be right. Well, so in terms of just how I got into this research, a lot of it just had to do with just, I guess, how I grew up. I was raised Muslim, originally from Jersey, right outside of Newark. The way my dad raised me, he was always very adamant that, we Muslims, we about the Quran and the Sunnah, but his understanding of that wasn't what a lot of people's is, this sort of closed off, well, if you don't see the Sunnah the way I do, then I don't like it. It was much more capacious, much more what I've come to realize, much more in line with how classical scholars sort of understood it, sort of the big tent of Ahlul Sunnah. So, he would take me to the Imam Muhammad Masjid. He would take me to what I now realize was sort of one of the first Salafi mosques in Jersey. When I moved down south, at 9, I'm in South Carolina, but I would spend my summers in New York, and I would go to the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, the historic Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood in Harlem. I would go to Masjid Taqwa, and I would just hang out, And I mean, once I found out they was making Juma in the Nation, I would go there sometimes, just wherever, When I moved down south, I encountered a brother. It was a very small Muslim community. Wasn't a lot of Muslims, but there was an older African-American brother who just kind of took me under his wing and just became my adopted uncle, a brother named Ayub Jones. Really amazing elder who, had a similar kind of orientation as my dad did and as I did. And he would always tell me about the mosque that he frequented and his teacher. And it turns out it was Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, who I mentioned in the piece, the historic State Street Masjid, 143 State Street, oldest mosque in New York. Some say oldest, some say second oldest, but it's the oldest that's still around. And, he would tell me stories about Sheikh Dawood. Really left a big impression on me. Then I went away to college, Durham, North Carolina. I ended up meeting another brother, elder brother, incredibly dynamic, well-respected educator, leader in the community, brother by the name of Hajj Dawood Haroun, who passed away a couple years ago. And real important mentor. Come to find out, he was Sheikh Dawood's personal secretary. So I was learning about this older history of Islam in America, but specifically in New York. And when I finished college, I moved up to New York and moved up to Harlem. And around that same time, a couple of works came out about the history of Black Muslims. And I noticed that the stories that I was hearing from all of these elders in these communities that I was visiting weren't really reflected in the literature. So something's wrong. So I started, talking to some of the elders. Around this time, I also began to study with a man named Sheikh Amin Abdul who was the top student of Dr. Suleiman Dunya, the luminary from Al-Azhar University, who for a number of years was the imam at the Islamic Cultural Center on 72nd Street. So I was learning all this stuff and I was reading this material and stuff wasn't aligning. So I started interviewing some of the elders in the community. And finally I realized I decided to go get a PhD in this stuff to learn how to really document it properly, right? And to, be able to eat while I did it. So that's important, right? Sponsorship. And so that's really how I got into doing this research, and I am now working on a book based on my PhD research that chronicles the history of Black Muslim communities in and around New York City from 1929 to 1990. So,
wow, 1929 to 1999?
Those 1929 to 1990. That would have been fly. 1990.
So I'm not good at math. How many years is that?
I'm not great at math. Yeah. That's what? That's like 61 years.
Wow. Okay. That's gonna be. I'm excited for that. I mean, a lot of the names and that you mentioned, right, are names that I kind of grew up knowing too, right? So like Sheikh Dawood and State Street. My mother, that's where she used to go when she first became Muslim. And I was telling Rasul, I have a bunch of cassette tapes I found recently in her archive from the 70s, or classes that Dr. Dunya was giving to these sort of Black Muslim women, right? In New York City and the tri-state. So I'm excited, about that. And I think those connections are important. And I wondered, so you're doing a PhD in history and Africana studies. And I guess, so part of what you're saying is you saw stuff being done, but there were parts of it missing, right? And so you want to sort of kind of give us a fuller story or a more complete story, right? And I wonder if you could say maybe about, maybe some things that you found.
You froze. What happened? I don't know if I froze or they froze. Oh, okay. I'm talking, so I guess I'm not frozen. But yeah, okay. So I think what Dr. Suwad was going to ask me is what were some of the interesting things that I found. Right? I think we got you back, right?
Oh, okay. I'm frozen because I was like, what's happening here? Okay. Yes. So yes. Interesting things that you found. Yes.
So I think one of the most interesting things that I found was just how far back this history goes. In terms of the Sufism piece, that was one of the things that really stuck out to me. Hajj Dawood Haroun, who I mentioned, he wrote a tribute piece that some folks may be familiar with. I think we actually ran it on Sapelo as well, about Sheikh Dawood. And he mentions that Sheikh Dawood was a muqaddam, was a representative of a Sufi sheikh from Algeria named Sheikh Ahmed Al-Alawi. Martin Lings has a book about him. And, Sheikh Dawood, from what I've learned, was not very vocal about that. He understood Islam on a high enough and deep enough level that he could talk to ulama when they would visit from around the world, and he saw Sufism as a part of the broader Islamic tradition. That wasn't something strange or weird, but that didn't mean that he necessarily thought it was good for this community of folks who most people are only Muslim, maybe a year, maybe a month, maybe a couple of years to be diving into tasawwuf, you know. So he didn't share it with a lot of people. And so because of that, it's been very hard to sort of try to date, you know, when that connection was made. But I had a conversation with a brother from Chicago, actually, by the name of Umair Hasib, who spent time studying in Morocco. And while he was there, he met with some of the representatives of the Tariqa in Morocco. And he was told that and he had learned about this from perhaps reading, he might have read the piece on Sapelo. And so he asked him about it, and he said they told him that Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi actually, there's a ledger of all of his muqaddams, and Sheikh Dawood's name is on this ledger.
Wow.
And so if that's the case, Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi passed away in 1934. So that means Sheikh Dawood's relationship to Tasawwuf and to the Tariqa goes all the way back to the 1930s. Which adds up, because one of the things that Haj Haroon shared with me is that his introduction to the Tariqa had to do with him being a part of this very internationalist scene in Harlem in the 1930s, where he had close contact with African immigrants from Somalia, Sudan, from West Africa as well. And many of them were merchant seamen, as well as Yemeni Muslims as well. And then later, a number of South Asian Muslims. But in this context, he made these kind of connections, and a lot of these merchant seamen had been members of this Tariqa, members of this order. So that was something that really sort of jumped out to me. And it really sort of drives home some of the points that I make in my overall sort of argument of the book, is that one, that Black Muslims have always been really connected to the global Muslim world, the global Muslim community, and participating in the conversations that Muslims were having around the world, right? And then also that early Black Muslim communities emerged out of this Black internationalist context, right? So some of the literature would give you the impression that Black Muslims prior to maybe the 1960s or even 70s are really, really provincial, really parochial, really sort of US-centric, don't necessarily know that much about their religion. On top of that, just kind of everything sort of made up out of this African-American context. And Sheikh Dawood's story really kind of explodes that myth.
Could you say maybe, and just a little bit more about why you think that, like, why do you think that is the story about Black Muslims, right? This idea that people aren't international, that they're parochial, they're really, you know, small and local.
Yeah, I remember when I was at Penn, Fred Moten came and gave a presentation. And, you know, Fred Moten, for people who don't know, is amazing, you know, scholar, literary critic. He's way over my head. I barely, you know, but seeing him speak, he was super down to earth. And at some point, you know, he kind of went off. He got real down to earth and kind of went off on this other professor, who started talking about how, like, parochial and provincial, you know, Black American folks were. And he was like, what in the world are you talking about? You know, so I think it may be, I'm speculating, but I think it has to do with just the way Black folks in general is seen. And some of it has to do with the fact that these international, you know, so this international consciousness that Black folks had really from our entire time in this sojourn in the wilderness of North America. It's based on a critique of U.S. imperialism and, you know, third world solidarity. So there's always been a lot of effort to kind of quell that, quench that. And then the other thing I have to say, quite frankly, is that Black Muslims, Orthodox Muslims, have done some incredible, amazing things, but have never really been, up until now, great about documenting their history. Just kind of making it, not documenting it. So I will say that, to be fair, a lot of the folks who were writing about Muslims in the US at that time, there was obviously a focus on the nation, you know, which isn't bad. We need to have more work on the nation, but a lot of the narratives sort of obscure any presence of Black Sunni or Shia Muslims. And also, you know, to be fair, some of these folks just didn't have a lot of sources to draw from, you know. So for me, I decided, well, the only way I can tell this history is find as many people who are still around, who have a memory that goes back to the 50s or even the 40s, or have sort of embodied sort of this oral tradition, this oral of Islam, and use that as a way to kind of like point me in the right direction, and then find other stuff to corroborate it and fill in the gaps.
No, I think that's dope. And I want to just point out, like, to folks that what he's saying, how important it is about what you're saying, right? In terms of like, because what you're saying is that on one hand, right, in terms of Black folks in general, and therefore extends to Black Muslims, is that part of the way white supremacy works is to make us, people without a past, without a history. We haven't done anything, we haven't gone anywhere, we don't have connections elsewhere, right? So to kind of cut you off internationally. But then the way in which people study, right, is you study because someone wrote something down on a piece of paper somewhere. And as if that paper is the truth, right? Right? And therefore, because there's a kind of emphasis on what people have written somewhere, all this other knowledge and information that's just around is not being collected. And so what you're doing is really important, right? Because you're both kind of giving us collecting information and knowledge that we otherwise wouldn't have, but you're also, I think, pushing back on, and this is a bit of a nerdy intellectual thing, but you're pushing back on like what counts as knowledge, right? And what counts as history, right? It's not just if you can find, the Sheikh's ledger, that's great. Right. But also there's someone else who's like, yeah, I remember because he was here when he was, that kind of thing too. So I think that's really important about what you're doing. And I think I just wanted to shout that out. So as far as I know, you are a Black Sufi who is writing about or studying Black Sufis. And I wanted to know if you could talk about that, because I feel like, anyway, I'm not going to give it any preface, but I don't know if you can talk about that.
Word. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I need help with this one. So I mean, first of all, to the extent that you could call me a Black Sufi, that title is purely aspirational, the term Sufi is a person who's mastered the science of tasawwuf, which you could translate as spiritual purification, right? And I'm, barely mastered the science of, I can make a real good bean pie, that's about it.
But, that actually did, let's shout out his bean pie, because I had one. It was good. Okay.
It's really my wife's bean pie. She taught me how to make it. So it's
okay. All right.
I'm a student, you know what I'm saying? So a Sufi is one who's mastered tasawwuf, just like a Qari is one who's mastered the recitation of the Quran. A Faqih is one who's mastered the science of fiqh, or Islamic legal jurisprudence, if you will. So, I'm far from that. But I am somebody who subscribes to a Sufi path, a Sufi order, which, and the order that I'm a part of is the Tijani order, which is founded, is named after a sheikh born in Algeria, who was buried in Morocco, named Sheikh Ahmed Tijani, rahimahullah. And the largest branch of the order is actually the branch that I'm connected to, which is based in Senegal. It's the branch that was founded by Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, who's one of the most would say the most sort of prolific West African Muslim scholar of the 20th century. His branch of the order, some historians have called it the largest religious organization or religious community on the African continent in history. As far as tariqas go, it's pretty clearly the largest sort of branch of the Sufi order too, because it's so popular on the African continent. So the conservative estimates are maybe 60 million strong worldwide. And that's a very conservative estimate. So that's the community I'm a part of. And as I mentioned in the piece, and I didn't want to make this, I mean, obviously the piece is a piece about a history of Black Sufis. So I didn't want to just talk about, my community. So I was very sort of sensitive to that. But I do mention Sheikh Hassan Sisi, rahimahullah, a scholar from West Africa, who's the grandson and inheritor of Sheikh Ibrahim, and the son of Sheikh Ibrahim's top student, whose name was Sidi Ali Sisi. And Sheikh Hassan came to the States in the 1970s and really attracted a lot of African-American Muslims who were sort of the forerunners of a lot of the different older Sunni masajid in places like New York and Detroit, Cleveland and Atlanta and Chicago. And he was supported in that work by his brothers. So Sheikh Hassan passed away some years back, and the successors of his movement were his brothers who supported him. So Imam Sheikh Tijani Sisi, who's the current Imam of the headquarters of the masjid in Medina Bay, Senegal, and Sheikh Muhammad Umayyad Sisi, who's my teacher. And for anybody who doesn't know, when we say we follow a tariqa, all it means is that there's some extra prayers, some extra what's the word they use? Supererogatory, extra optional,
Optional.
optional prayers that we make. Why are all the words translated in these real?
So right, so it's like in other words, like it's like meritorious and like or like supererogatory or
Right.
Circumambulation, right?
Don't nobody talk like that. Just go around, right? Not circumvent, going around. But anyway,
Right.
well, this means I do some extra prayers on top of the obligatory things that all the Muslims around the world do, and that I have, leaders, scholars, Muslim scholars that I've made myself accountable to, all just to the end of trying to clean my heart and develop, improve my character, right? So that's all anybody doesn't know. Not never flown on no carpet, nothing like that. And I think
that's sad. Too bad. Anyway.
Well, maybe one day, but
maybe one day, right?
Maybe one day. We ain't got there yet. I said I'm not Sufi yet, but nah. And I think one of the big challenges of writing a piece like this, when you're so close to the research, is for one, trying to, like I said, not make it just sort of a celebration of my community, right? But really a more expansive history that's fair and that's as, I'm not gonna say objective because there's no such thing, but as honest as I could be. And also figuring out sort of who not to mention, right? Because the history is just so expansive. So I mentioned Imam Sayyid Abdul Salam, who was the first muqaddam of the Tijani Tariqa in America. I mentioned Haji Karima Abdul Karim, who, as well known throughout the community for her philanthropy and as sort of a cultural ambassador, and also one of the very first people to take the Tariqa. But there's so many people I didn't mention. I didn't mention, for instance, Imam Sayyid's wife, Sister Salwa Abdul Salam, who unfortunately I never got a chance to meet. She passed away before I met the community, became a part of the community. But the way, one family member of Imam Sayyid's put it, she was sort of his backbone, and everything that he was doing with her support, and she was making it possible, I mentioned a brother named Sheikh Abdul Azim Shabazz, who played a pivotal role in building a number of masajid in New York City, and who, went on to be sort of one of the foremost people in spreading the order around the country. I didn't get to mention Al-Haji Ahmed Dimson, who was a Ghanaian brother, because one of the big parts of this story is that there was a Ghanaian community of Muslims already here. And so a big part of the story of the rise of not just the Tijani Tariqa, but also the Burhaniya Tariqa, other Turuq that had connections to the African continent, was this exchange between Black American and West African folks. Dimson was a brother who was here who was very knowledgeable and very supportive of the African American community and encouraged Sheikh Hassan to make affairs among the, I don't want to say indigenous, but the sort of the African American, Muslim people. I didn't get to mention Haja Ashaki Tahasise, who was the executive director of Sheikh Hassan's NGO, who did incredible work for years, advocacy work and humanitarian work around facing women and children. I didn't get to mention my uncle, Brother Hajj Abdul Majid, who was one of the first brothers from the Caribbean, Jamaican brother to take this rig. I didn't get to mention Muqaddam Bilal from Detroit, who was one of the first to travel to Senegal, to Medina Baye. I didn't get to mention Dr. Khadija Askari, who was a sister who came out of the Dar in Imam Jamil's community, who built the first clinic in Medina Baye after years of healthcare work here in the States. Both, sort of, what's the word, regular white man medicine and sort of natural medicine,
Right. Homeopathic
medicine, and bringing, doctors to Senegal to serve the African and African community. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to mention Imam Salim and Dr. Karima Joseph. And Imam Salim is actually mentioned in Sally Howe's book, Oldest Imam in Detroit. A member of the collective, the Bays, right? This sort of artistic and religious collective of Muslims who was sort of part of like pioneering Islam in Detroit. And I'll say one more person, I'm not even scratching the surface, right?
Right.
A sister we recently lost in DC, a sister by the name of Haji Waduda Henderson. And she was an educator for years. And I'll say I'll end this sort of list with this anecdote. I remember I went to her janazah in DC, and I met elder brother, old musician, accomplished in the community. And, I was talking to him and he said, Sister Waduda, I love that sister. She was a real forerunner in Islam. I couldn't keep up with it. He said, anything I got involved with in Islam, she had already done it and sort of graduated past it. When I joined the Islamic Party, she had already kind of graduated from that. She studied with Dr. Dunya for a time, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into Tasawwuf, to the Shadli Tariqa, she had already been in that and got out of it. And then when I became Tijani, she had already been Tijani and sent her son to Medina Ba to study, you know.
Right.
So these were the kinds of people who were attracted to the path. And these were the kind of stories that I couldn't tell just
Mm-hmm.
because there wasn't enough room, you know. And that's just
Right.
in my own community. There are whole
Right.
communities that I didn't really have space to talk about. There's a brother
Right.
that I'm learning more about now, Imam Bilal Abdul Kareem. This was a brother from New York who helped to introduce the Tasawwuf to a lot of folks in the Dawn of Islam movement. He was Shadili, same tariqa as Sheikh Dawood, so I'm trying to see if there's a connection there.
Right. Right.
Goes to Atlanta and really introduces Sufism really to the community in Atlanta, you know, African American Muslims. And part of the reason we don't know of him is he was tragically killed, you know. So these are just some of the stories that I couldn't say. So
right.
In the community, you always have
right.
problem of, okay, who don't I talk about?
You know? Right, because people will come for you too, right? You know? but I think, you know. Right. No, I mean, and you know, we got to be accountable, right, to our communities, right? So I think that's important, and I appreciate the care that you take in trying to do that. And I wonder, you mentioned, I guess I wanted to ask you a question. Well, two questions, and then we'll open to some of the questions from the audience. But you know, why is this important? Why is this history important? So, like, you know, when you, like, for example, when you first submitted the article for us to review, am I frozen again?
No, you're not frozen.
Okay, good. For article review, it's like, you know, sometimes with history, it just become a list of names and peoples and places, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, that's great that happened, but why is that important? Like, why should we know? Like, why is that important now? And so I wonder maybe if you could speak a bit to that. Like, what do you think is, like, why does this history matter for us now?
Right. So I mean, so for one, I think we're just at a point as Muslims in this part of the world, we need to have a comprehensive understanding of our religion. We need to have an informed view of the different ways that people practice Islam. So when I was doing my PhD, I lived in Philly, right? And before I went to Philly, I'd heard all these crazy stories about how Philly is super Salafi and the Muslims just wild. And I had a great time in Philly. And one of the things that I learned is that, you know, most people in Philly is just like Muslims anywhere else. They're just doing their best to practice their faith. And their understanding of it is colored by how they were introduced to it, you know? So if you grew up in the Gulf, you know, you're going to have one, you know, approach to Islam. If you grew up in Iran, it's going to be different. If you grew up in Senegal, it's going to be something different. And similarly, even in the States, if you grew up on the West Coast or the East Coast, you know, I had one imam in Philly told me that, you know, he served in South Philly for a while. And, you know, it was challenging. And one day he asked the brothers, you know, what's going on? He said, Imam, we love you. We believe you're teaching us the right way, but you're not from South Philly. You're from West Philly. You know what I mean? So these are the kind of, you know, divisions we have to get past. And from that, it made me reflect on the fact that, you know, there's a sort of taboo, right, about Sufism. Like Sufis have been branded a certain kind of way. And I think a lot of that has to do with, well, for one, I'll say when you have an informed view of where all these different camps and approaches come from, you're able to see that pretty much everybody has something good. Pretty much everybody's argument has some truth to it. So when you see that, you know, it allows for a different kind of unity, you know. So for instance, if I'm teaching a class, you know, on fiqh, I'm not gonna say, yeah, those Salafis, they just don't know what they're talking about. Like, no, this is where they're coming from. This is where that argument comes from. And perhaps I disagree with certain extremes that people go to in that camp, but there's not this sort of, it's similar to when, you know, growing up, you know, when I would read little pamphlets about the Shia, and it would have you thinking that Shias were like worshiping like trees or something crazy. And then when I met Shia Muslims, like, oh, okay, I understand this. It's a different narrative about history. Right, I can get that, right. And then I think on a maybe even a more important, you know, sort of point is we at this point as Muslims in this part of the world need to have, I think, a real honest and more sophisticated conversation about what is bid'ah, you know, what is this bid'ah stuff, right? And you know, I think that. You know, when it comes to the idea of, you know, what kind of ibadah we do, you know. The reality is, even if you look at the works of Ibn Taymiyyah, you know, there were things that he was of the opinion that you could do things like carry the Quran and, you know, carry du'as with you and make du'as and blow in water and drink all this stuff that sounds crazy to people now.
Right.
People it sounds crazy to will say, well, what Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah said is legit.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that everybody has to feel comfortable with the same thing. All of this is talking about a little bit supererogatory stuff, right?
Right. But I wonder too if there's a part of it too, and I think I had this conversation once a little bit with Ubaidullah Evans, you know, who also is Azhari and with Alam, and this idea that I think there's also a sense that when like our like my parent generation, when people converted to Islam, you know, they were sort of moving away from or leaving Christianity, right? And Christianity carried a lot of weight, negative weight, right? In terms of like, you know, being the white man religion, being this kind of, you know, this kind of mystical or whatever stuff that really was meant to sort of divert you from the real and what you had to handle, right? And so, and also, you know, having you worship a man, these kinds of things, right? So I also think part of the kind of skepticism that you find sometimes in Black Muslim communities around Sufism and tariqas and this idea of having a sheikh and this person who, you know, is kind of your guide, right? A guide for you, I think might also come out of that, right? Like in terms of just people being really not wanting to sort of re-engage with the same things that they were leaving. Although I also often tell people though too, like, you know, I spent some time, you know, different parts of the kind of in majority Muslim countries. And, you know, the way people treat their sheikh, like, I mean, this is the way we treat our imams here. You know what I mean? So like on some level, like people are skeptical and I understand that, but that kind of reverence, that kind of love, sometimes some forms of kind of like, you know, loyalty and that kind of stuff. I mean, we do similar things. We might call it differently. And we may not be in a tariqah, but it looks the same, at least to me.
Well, and you know, it's interesting because I feel like one of the things that Sufism or Tasawwuf allows us to do is engage in this kind of project of translation, you know. As much as Tasawwuf may seem like weird to, and I think that's a great point, that a lot, like we as Muslims in this part of the world, we have our own story, we have our own journey, and this sort of break from Christianity has a lot to do with it, right? So it colors what we find compelling and what we don't, you know. But at the same time, it puts us in a real combative space, you know. I grew up in South Carolina, wasn't no Muslims. And this kind of like, oh, you know, these Christians is just this, that, and the third, that didn't really, you know, win me no friends, you know. But as I learned about, you know, this tradition of Islamic spirituality, it made my own journey, I think, more legible to people who grow up Muslim or didn't become Muslim because they just decided they were just fed up with whatever. Some people I've met had a very good experience in whatever their path was before they were Muslim, but they still want to be Muslim, you know.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Sufis generally are the people who spread Islam pretty much all over the world, you know. Another thing I wanted to say, and this is what I was searching for before. I think one of the real important things one of the reasons why I think this story is really important and this research is important is because I think it demonstrates the fact that why Black folks become Muslim, it's not only this sort of expression of like a radical Black politics or rejection of Christianity or white supremacist approach to Christianity. It's that too, but it's also, you know, people find this Islamic spirituality, you know, incredibly compelling. So when I talk about Imam Saeed, for instance, in the book that will come out one day, hopefully, inshallah, you'll make dua. Part of why his story is so incredible is he, as many people, but he's just sort of a person who, you know, is close and near and dear to my heart. Just his journey as a person who, you know, was a Black nationalist, you know, from Harlem, 1950s, right? And then sort of ultimately and goes through his own journey as a spiritual seeker, in different sort of iterations of Black religion as a very young man, and then ultimately joins the nation, and then sort of evolves beyond that and, you know, visits 303 and Sheikh Dawood's masjid, and then becomes a founder of the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood. And ultimately he reaches a point where he feels like, you know, this Sunni Islam and this sort of Black radical approach to Sunni Islam is great. He loves it, but he as he put it, he said, there needed to be more, that the community needed to go in a more spiritual direction. And so he had been, a long time imam, naib of the Mosque of Sound Brotherhood. And he eventually left on very good terms, wasn't no beef, but he just had to kind of continue to grow and ultimately found Sheikh Hassan. And for him, this expression of, Islamic spirituality didn't take away from the fact that he still was invested in Black power. But this is what he found compelling as a spiritual seeker. And I think that doesn't get talked about in the narrative nearly enough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, oh my God. There's I'm like, we're like running out of time, and there's so many things I want to ask you about, because I'm thinking about like the spirituality, mysticism, and music and art, right? Because I know you kind of referenced that too, and like how that be connected. But I want to take like a question or two, and I have a final question for you, but I'm going to take a question or two that we got from the audience, which I think is like over 100 people strong. So that's exciting. And I think, but related to this, I think, so there was a question about, so the question is, can we touch base on why it's important to distinguish the different sects of Sufism and their practices, especially when it comes to why you'll see more Black American Muslims in one sect and not as many in another. So that's the question. And I think, and I want to just add to that question too, because I think you made a point too about like Africa and connecting to Africa. And so I also wonder like what role that also plays in which tariqa people are sort of, lean towards or not.
Right. Well, the reality is people are in every tariqa, right? And Black folk in a whole bunch. I mentioned in the piece, Black folk who have introduced folks to the Ba'alawi tradition, which is becoming more and more popular now, which I personally am happy to see. It's not friends in that path, And
the Ba'alawi is, where's the home base?
Yemen.
Okay.
Yemen, yeah. Which, thank you for reminding me to let everyone else know. So I don't want to give the impression that this, one of the first, Black Sufi Jamaats to emerge, really sort of at around the same time as the Tijanis is, the Qadri Jamaat, where folks from the Darul Islam movement, begin to connect with a Qadri Sheikh from Pakistan. So it would be, I think, misleading to say, well, every, Black people only engage in these African Sufi orders. But I think it would be accurate to say that most of them do, and I think that has to do with, just the fact that, the reality is, if you want to talk about the history of Sufism in America, you're talking about, enslaved African Muslim women and men, from societies where tasawwuf was a huge part. And we have evidence of that from their writings. I was reading something the other day, reading Blyden's description of certain Edward Wilmot Blyden, Afro-Caribbean missionary who's considered by some the father of Pan-Africanism. And he goes to West Africa and he's hanging out with these Muslims and he's like, Islam is cool. I'm not really seeing how these people are all that wrong. And when you read how he's describing the Islam he's coming into contact with, it's pretty clear that he's talking about not just Sufis, but Tijanis. These are the people that he's encountering because of the language that he's using. He's pulling stuff from Salatul Fatih. It's real interesting. So the reality is, because of that, part of the story I tell is that, Muslims, Black Muslims in this part of the world have always been interested in connecting with Africa, connecting with Islam on the African continent. At certain points in history, it's more of a sort of, and I don't mean this as derisively at all, but more sort of the imagined community of people of African descent in the diaspora, connecting with that history, I should say, is a better way to put it. But then by the 60s and 70s, people are actually traveling. They're going to Senegal, they're going to Sudan transnationally, they're becoming fluent in these languages, in Arabic and Wolof, and it just creates a kind of organic connection. And it creates an organic connection with Black Muslims in Africa who have been dealing with anti-Black racism in the cosmopolitan Muslim world for 1,000 years, So there's all these, reasons why I think Black folk do often gravitate toward these African-based Sufi orders. And in terms of why it's important to distinguish between the different sets and practices, I think it's important because anytime you paint folks with a broad brush, there's a problem. The reality is Islam. Forget about Sufis. Islam, as Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, famously said, I'm not sure if he's the first person to say this or not. He's the first person I heard say this. Like if Islam was water,
right.
being water, it would take on the sort of the color and the flavor of the rocks that it would flow over. So Islam in Senegal looks different than Islam in India.
Right.
Different than Islam in Yemen. And if the Tasawwuf is about sort of cultivating people's spirituality, the way you go about cultivating spirituality for a Black man in New York City is going to be different than the way it is for somebody in that place.
So we have one other question from the audience that's interesting. I think they asked, would you characterize Malcolm as a Black American Sufi?
I don't know. I don't know. I think when you start talking about what is a Sufi, somebody asked me, "Are you a Sufi?" I said, "What is a Sufi to you?" Malcolm clearly, when you read his autobiography and biographies of him, and talk to people who knew him more than me, he was clearly a deeply spiritual man, and he was clearly a spiritual seeker. And why he, in the last year, or really the last 9 months of his life, he did spend some time in the Muslim world and in West Africa. And some of the people that he connected with were African Sufis. Now, I don't have any knowledge of him joining any kind of Sufi path or anything. But, so I don't know. I'm not going to jump out the window and say yes, but I'm certainly not going to say no.
Right. No, thank you. So I want to ask you one question for myself, and then we're going to close out. So I wonder, one of the things that you mentioned a couple of times in your reflections tonight, right, this idea of, like, one of the things about Sufis, like when I think of Sufis or Sufism, right, is I think of like how people protect spiritual protection, right? So, you read this amount of, you say, La ilaha illallah this many times, or you do this or you do that, right? Like regular salah, all these things. We do them as a form of spiritual protection. And I wonder if you feel like this tradition, whether it's Sufism or Tasawwuf broadly speaking, but specifically like the Black American, the way Black folks in the diaspora, on this side of the hemisphere, on this side of the Atlantic, right, the way that they've engaged Sufism or Tasawwuf, like, are there any spiritual protections that you think are offered for us right now? Right? Like, we're in a plague, like we're literally in a plague, it's one of those things where you're like, you hear these stories about stuff and you're like, what was it like to live through that? Like, we're living through it now. And I wonder if you think that tradition offers us anything that, we can draw on.
Yeah. I think it offers a lot. So for me, I'm hesitant, to, I remember Dr. Jackson gave a lecture once, Sherman Jackson gave a talk, and somebody had asked him about like Al-Rad, doing different kind of prayers and whatnot. And his answer was interesting. He said, I may have certain, any scholar may have certain, routines that they do. But to sort of throw that out, for the world to bear is, sort of another, another undertaking. So I'm hesitant. I mean, there's certainly, I think, a wealth in our tradition of things that people can do to protect themselves. Everything from, the Quran is a healing, and even if a person doesn't have a like super deep knowledge of their deen, if you know Qul huwallahu ahad, Qul a'udhu birabbil falaq, Qul a'udhu birabbin nas, you have big protection. If you have Fatiha, you have big protection. In terms of some of the deeper sciences that are out there, deeper, methods that people have derived from the Quran and the Sunnah to be able to protect themselves, I would say that's above my pay grade, but it's not hard to connect with people who have that knowledge. And some of it is not hard to come by. There's different prayers. There's things like Hizbul Bahr. I don't want to go too deep into specifics, but whether it's reciting, I mean, we know from the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that his companions would recite things for protection. We know that they would carry things with them for protection. There's hadith about that. Some of them suggest that maybe the people who were carrying them were people who weren't the most literate, but nonetheless, we know that this is something that's from the Sunnah. So carry your dua, and people like Ali, Ibn Abbas, they talked about carrying duas with them, carrying verses of Quran with them, reciting certain prayers. I was just reading in Ibn Taymiyyah's book of Fatawa. He even, talks about the validity of praying over water and drinking it, all these, all these kinds of things. So there's definitely, I mean, I will shout out my brother Ibrahim Dimson in Atlanta, because he recently has been in correspondence with Imam Sheikh Tijani in Senegal, and Imam Sheikh Tijani gave some prescriptions for people to use. So I'm hesitant to put that out on a platform, but if people are interested, check out my brother Ibrahim Dimson.
No.
Communication from Imam Sheikh Tijani, and he has some things we can.
No, and thank you for that. I think one of the things that stood out for me the most of what you said is that, kind of, the accessibility of this kind of thing, right? So from the just the simple prayer you make to God, right, to protect me, you know what I mean, to something that might be more sort of like extensive that you get because someone, has some knowledge that you don't have, right? But this range of ways, right, that I think are there, and I think also just kind of going back to the point we made earlier about people and relationships and stuff and choices around Sufism and spirituality. I think one of the things that I find right now is that, like, my generation, I find people, whereas maybe some of our parents' generation had kind of moved away from the more kind of ecstatic or mystical type of sort of traditions because of what their experience was, like us wanting to reclaim those things, and those things not being Muslim, but also like just African, Afro-diasporic, these different ways in which, you kind of relationship to the natural world and to the and unseen, right, I think are things that have become, I think, more compelling for a lot of folks too, and looking for ways to return to that as well. So I think and maybe we'll have you come back, you can write something for Sapelo or something like that, thinking about that. I want to ask you, can you tell people, like, if people want to read anything else you've written or just follow you, or like, how could they do that?
Well, first, can I say something else real quick? You just said. So the Prophet ﷺ taught us that dua is the weapon of the believer, So, just like you said, simple dua, just asking your Lord, to help you is big. And when you talk about, you're right. I mean, in our generation, I think many of us have reacted to the ways in which the blessed and understandable and sincere militancy of a lot of our parents with, sunnah and no bid'ah, I think took them to an extreme in some cases, but it's an understandable extreme, because if you're coming from an experience where, you come from a tradition that you feel is steeped in personality worship and shirk, quite frankly, that's a natural sort of, it's a natural sort of reaction. But for many of us who grew up, I mean, I can say, even as open-minded as my dad was and as great as my experience was, my experience in the Muslim community as a young man was incredibly difficult, because, okay, I can go to this masjid if I want to learn something about hadith, but I feel like it's just a stale experience where there's no spirituality. And I can go to this masjid where there's some good, spiritual teachings and exchange, but, there's not really a very high level of sort of intellectual engagement with the tradition. And who, I mean, I've met so many people, encountered so many people who found Islam compelling and then spent time in the Muslim community and then left and then ran, And some of it, I think, does have to do with the fact that in some cases we've gotten away from the fact that our religion is a holistic religion that acknowledges the unseen, that does not have a sort of materialistic, philosophical materialism attached to it, right? But I think one of the things that the Tasawwuf does offer is that balance, right? It's, an expression of spirituality that's very much grounded in Islamic tradition, very much grounded in Islamic orthodoxy, I would argue, but at the same time speaks to just the very human need to have that sort of transcendent, cathartic spiritual experience. So in terms of other stuff I've read, most of I've written is almost Sapelo. I'm a newly minted PhD, so the publications are just coming out. Inshallah, there'll be something coming out later this year on actually the same topic. It's an edited volume in a book called Varieties of American Sufism. So that should be coming out soon, inshallah. And there's some other things in the works about sort of Black Muslim political economy and how Black Muslims engage questions of race. I saw my brother Akil Fad, shout out, Salam Alaikum, asked a question about jazz musicians. I talked a little bit about that and some of the stuff that's forthcoming. And then, make dua. Hopefully this book comes out, so I can keep reading this.
No. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase you and to give you facility in your endeavors, because we recognize, the significance of what you're doing, for right now and for the future. And I want to thank you again for your piece. So folks if you didn't read the piece, it's called The Black American Sufi History. It's on Sapelo Square, sapelosquare.com. That was about 2 weeks ago that piece came out. There's a really cool timeline also that was created for that, to kind of sort of give you another view, just another way to understand or the information that he offered. Again, like he said, he has other work he's done on the Dar al-Islam, on Black Muslim activism, right? That's been on Sapelo Square. And we're just so excited that you were here with us tonight. I want to just remind folks, Ramadan's coming next week. And one of the things that we have done for the past, 4 years now at Sapelo is we offer Ramadan reflections, right? So we sort of ask Black Muslim scholars and activists and artists to reflect, on a juz each day of the month of Ramadan. So those will start coming out. Ramadan will be, what is it, Thursday, Friday? I guess depending on what you're doing, calculating your moon. I'm a moon person personally, but we'll be starting it out. And those are also a great way, I think, to sort of connect and to reflect and to sort of understand, to help us kind of connect, particularly now, I think, right? In this time where we're not going to be able to sort of be in physical community in the way that many of us are accustomed to being in Ramadan, but we can still be connected, right? And we can still grow and we can still learn and we can still build our relationship with our Lord and with each other. So look for that coming out next week. And also one other thing I wanted to say, so some folks might be familiar with Black Iftar that started last year, right? Which was, again, one of those in-person events that really sort of focused on kind of bringing that Ramadan spirit in a way that really connected to our experiences, right, as Black people. And so the founder of Black Iftar, Samir Abdurrahman, and I are going to do a conversation on Monday. I think we're going to do 3 Pacific, 6 Eastern, sort of a Ramadan, just talking about what we think Ramadan is going to be like this year, right? And what are some of the ways we can stay connected, stay healthy, stay, sort of sane, we're all, what I mean? And stay safe in this month. So also look out for that, come back to our page and you'll see information for that as well. But otherwise, I think, I want to thank Rasul again. I want to thank everybody who's watching us. And since you opened us with such a wonderful opening, Rasul, would you mind just closing us out with something inspirational?
And real quick plug, I want to encourage everybody out there to consider writing for Sapelo. We need to go out and document this history and contribute these stories.
Most definitely.
The leading platform to do that. Inshallah. But thank you again. Alhamdulillah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم أرنا حقا حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا باطلا باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا مقيما اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من فتنة المحيا والممات ومن فتنة القبر ومن فتنة المسيح الدجال ومن عذاب النار وسوء المصير اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من الهم والحزن ونعوذ بك من العجز والكسل ونعوذ بك من الجبن والبخل ونعوذ بك من غلبة الدين وقهر الرجال اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق الناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, y'all.